Okay, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Doug and Carmi Show, your one-stop shop for all things Commanders. It is Friday, so we're going inside the command center. Help us take a little better look at the organization is our good buddy Mark Bullock. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good. I'm sure over the years I have asked you and we have discussed it, but for those that are watching that don't know, how did you get into football and primarily more so the Redskins Washington football team Commanders?
Yeah. For those that don't know, I'm from the UK, and you can probably tell from the accent. Although I was told just yesterday on Twitter, someone said, "Oh, what happened to your accent? You sound too American now." I think I'm caught in between. The Brits think I'm American, and the Americans think I'm British. But yes. So my dad's job took us out to the States when I was literally like a week before I turned 5, and we spent 5 years out there. And we lived just outside DC. And then we moved back, and I kind of fell out of US stuff, and went into UK sports like our football, and cricket, and what have you here. And then sort of when I was turning 16, 17, 18, the NFL started being shown on TV here a lot more frequently. And so I started to get into it, and I've always kind of liked analyzing sports, and breaking down like why things happen rather than just it. I think part of it comes from my dad was one of those typical sports fans of like shouting at the referee and shouting at player, being like, "What are you doing?" And you don't know what you're doing. You're terrible. And so rather than just shouting and getting angry, I learned from my dad in not what not to do, and kind of was like, okay, well, why was that guy in that position to do that thing? And what I found with the NFL was that it was kind of a really good sport because it's a single play, and then you stop, and then you reset, and you have another play. It was a really good sport to be able to analyze it in that kind of way. So I got more and more into the NFL, and naturally, because I'd spent 5 years near DC, I kind of picked Washington as the kind of team that I was most interested in. And I kind of stuck with Washington teams as I grew into other American sports like baseball and ice hockey, and not so much basketball, but still keep a vague interest in the Wizards as well. But yeah, so that's kind of how it all started.
So this isn't a fake accent you do just for the show here.
No, no. It's a weird blend, where there are certain words that I will say very American, and it's more the Brits that will point out like Twitter. I have to very For the word Twitter, I will consciously pronounce the T's because you guys call it Twitter and say the D, almost D instead of T. And I get caught up by people here that will be like, "Why are you saying it like that?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, I mostly deal with Americans, and that's how they say it." So yeah.
That's hilarious. And at one point you were with the Washington Post. I'm curious how that ended up happening. Of course, the writers everywhere, I think, were getting laid off en masse around the same time, kind of like the writing was going down. It's a two-part question. I'm curious how you ended up at the Post, and then what have you done? Because your level of breaking down the film obviously isn't just because you watch a ton of football. So I'm curious what you did to be able to get to where you are now as far as understanding the game.
So I'll start with the Post. Basically, when I first started doing any kind of writing, it was on the fan blog website Hogs Haven, the SB Nation site,
Mhm.
and I just started with a fan post. I think it was back in uh, the John Beck era. I think I had watched like a preseason game, and I saw a lot of people talking about what I can't even remember whether I said he was good or bad at the time. I was probably wrong. I was probably terribly wrong. I had no idea what I was talking about back then, but um, people were talking about a specific play, and I thought I feel like they're wrong on that. So I all I did was loaded up the play on Game Pass, and took screenshots, and was like and used Microsoft Paint to draw arrows on things and be like, this is what I'm looking at, and this is why I think you're wrong with this. And I posted that, and then people were like, "Oh my god, this is incredible!" And Kevin, one of the writers there at the time, asked me if I wanted to do that kind of thing regularly, and after maybe 2 years or 3 years of doing that, um, I have John Kime to thank, and John Kime doesn't know he has, I have him to thank him, but he took a job with the Washington Post for all of about 5 minutes, and it was meant to be a special job, like a special side beat reporting thing where he wasn't going to do as much beat reporting. They had beat reporters, so they had like Mike Jones and stuff at the time, um, but what they wanted him to do was more breakdown of why things were happening, and kind of the film stuff, and so he took that job, and then ESPN came in like five weeks or something like that after he had got given that job, and were like, "Hey, we want you to be our beat reporter." And so he went and jumped ship to ESPN, and suddenly at the last minute before the season started, the Washington Post needed someone, and somehow someone there saw my work on Hogs Haven, and they asked me to do it. So that's how I started with the Washington Post. In terms of learning what I know, it kind of just comes from me having too much time on my hands, and being a real nerd, and really watching back plays over and over again, and being like, well, why was that guy there, and why would he have done that thing, in that moment, and tried to watch as much as I can, basically, and then go online, and search up people that are way better than me at doing this stuff, and follow them, and read their articles, and try to learn as much from them, and read a few different books and stuff like that you learn football from. But I find the best way to learn it is to watch it, and just take time to watch a play, watch individual players, see what their roles are, and constantly ask yourself, why is this guy in this position trying to do this thing? Um, and generally, you'll find, especially if you're like charting things down, you'll start to see patterns of why someone's trying to do this and that, and yeah, that's kind of where my knowledge base has got come from.
And one of the things that I think is so helpful, the way you do things on Tuesdays when the do the breakdown on the channel, is most of the routes. A lot of people try to do this and don't know the route concepts or the why. You were saying like we're trying to figure out how we get from here to there. One of the things I think is great is that you have such a knowledge of the routes and the route trees, and so that when people are talking them on the TV sometimes. Like last night, I was thinking about our show from a couple weeks ago, but last night they were talking about a sluggo, which is a slant and go. And I like that on Tuesdays we discuss some of that because I'm not sure everybody, if they weren't watching Tuesday shows, would know what a sail route is, or some of these different. So I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most about what you do is that it provides enough of high level stuff, but yet still beginner 101 stuff so that people can really get an understanding of what it is that we're trying to talk about. And I know you do a lot of that in the Substack as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words there. That's what I try to do. I always try, like, I try to break everything down into as simple terms as I possibly can, and once you get to a certain point, you do need to use uh, terms to just for the sake of efficiency, and so like a sluggo or a sail route or concept, and um, different, like the difference between a wide zone and an inside zone, and those kind of things. Like I try to, certainly during the off season, I'll try to go into more detail of the specifics of those kind of things, and break those down, so that I can always point people in that direction. Be like, if you want to know more about this, check what I wrote in the off season about that. But I will generally go over it, and I'm quite a visual learner. So if I say this is a sale concept, I will try to draw up on a clip, and be able to show, like, so the sale concept is you have this guy running this route, this guy running this route behind it, and what have you, and that's what I try to do on the Tuesday shows, and that's what I try to do on my Substack, and seems like people like it, and yeah, I try to make it as simple as possible. And for me, when I was learning, and I'm still learning tons about football, I still have so much to learn, but when I was first starting out and trying to build a knowledge base, the things that I found the most interesting was when a coach would say, uh, like, "Oh, we ran this, like you say, a sluggo concept, or we ran this sail concept," and I'd be like, oh, "Okay, what does that mean? What was that?" And it was always kind of cool to be like, "Oh, I now know what a sail concept is, and I can go and uh, apply that to a different time in the game and be like, okay, I see that pattern again, and that's a sail concept, and okay, now this is a different look they're running it out of, and that kind of just improves the knowledge base, and I always found that cool, and that's probably me being a bit nerdy, football, X's and O's, nerdy stuff, um, but yeah, so I because that was always something interesting to me, I always try to put that across in an article of like someone could be reading it for the first time, not really knowing what things are. So I always try to include like just a very basic. Okay, for those that don't know, a sail concept is this, and a sluggo would be this, and a dragon concept is that, and what have you. So, um, yeah, I try to break it down as much as I can for people that might not be familiar or might be watching or reading for the first time.
I promise to the viewers we will get to the Commanders, but I was watching that Lions game yesterday. It's hard to imagine there's anybody calling better football these days than Ben Johnson. He's out there doing things we really haven't seen before.
He's certainly very innovative, and he is very very fun to watch. And obviously, when he was really heavily linked to Washington last year, I did a deep dive into him, and I watched basically all the Lions games last year. In once Washington's season was over and they were quite clearly going to move on from Rivera and go in a different direction, I kind of dived deep into the Lions, knowing that Ben Johnson was going to be one of the heavy names, and he's legit. He's a very very good play caller, and uh, like when you talk about best play callers in the league, obviously you think of guys like Andy Reid, Kyle Shanahan. He's right up there, and the way he sets things up and does things is really fun to watch. And I think everyone's kind of taken this like a shine to the Lions. Everyone kind of likes Dan Campbell and the way he goes about it, and everyone likes this kind of physical run first approach because it's so different, and it's not just like this miracle Patrick Mahomes running around, throw it up to Travis Kelsey, and like I think people are a little bit sick of that, and I understand why. Like obviously it's still amazing, and I'm sure Chiefs fans are not sick of that, but everyone else is. And so you get this very enthusiastic, very passionate coach in Dan Campbell, and this very physical, old school style. But Ben Johnson makes it fun. It's not just we're just going to run the same basic
Right.
duo play up the middle and it's going to be boring and they're going to get 3 yards of play every time. It's we're going to pull every lineman every which way, and we're going to hand the ball off to Penei Sewell, our right tackle, who's going to be lining up at tight end. And we're going to be doing fun stuff like that, and that makes it creative and fun, and obviously very very successful.
I don't know what they called it, and I can't remember if Romo gave it a term on the show, but they had Amon St. Brown run that mesh around the front
Oh
of the
yeah,
line, and then
they
kind of
call it,
use it as a whip back to. It wasn't necessarily a post, but you could see how nobody was going to follow him on that play. He was wide
yeah,
open.
they
Pretty
call it.
nice.
I think people are calling it mesh reverse or
Okay.
something like that. Yeah, it's one that I've seen once or twice before, but it's very very uncommon. Yeah, I don't think I've seen it much in the league. And of course, people that follow college football have been posting clips of it all morning, being like, "Yeah, I saw it here a few years ago from Clemson, and I saw it here from Alabama or whatever." But yeah, it was a cool play, and obviously it worked out for them. But it was one of those. It's kind of you need to. It's one of those plays where it makes you appreciate that there's more to it than just that cool route that he ran. It's that
Mhm.
normally they would run the mesh concept and the defense would be playing for that, and then but it's a long developing route, so you need the offensive line to be able to block for that, and they set that up well. And then Goff, sold the run fake well, and delivered a good ball, bought time in the pocket, and it was very well executed across the board. So yeah, it's one of those where you can appreciate the route is awesome, but when you just watch the playback and not focus on the route itself, you can be like, okay, that there's a lot more details going into it, and it's cool to see.
I thought maybe we were a year away from the NFL pivoting back to, the lighter the boxes got and the more DBs they put on the field, it just felt like somebody in the NFL was gonna pivot back to, "I will smash you in the face with the football every time you put 5, 6 DBs on the field," and shocker, the teams that went out and got Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley and Jacobs, and of course, maybe nobody's putting their run game better than the guy up there in Green Bay. Those run, sequences are fantastic, but it's nice to see that they've gotten back to some good old-fashioned smash mouth football. They just dress it up a little differently. It's what the Commanders were doing early, and it feels like ever since Brian Robinson wasn't healthy, it's been noticeable and it has had a great impact on the offense.
Yeah, it's been a weird few weeks for the run game, and I think missing Brian Robinson was certainly part of that. This game this weekend was kind of weird because the thing that they'd been successful at the start of the year was being so diverse with the gap schemes. I kind of talked about with Ben Johnson of being able to pull any lineman from any spot. That was what Washington was doing really well at the start of the year. They'd obviously run the sort of just the normal counter or power plays where you pull a guard and he goes to the other side of the line. But they would then run what I would call, or what most people would call, a GT counter, where you'd pull both the guard and the tackle to the other side, and then they would run um, plays where the guard would pull to the edge, and or the tackle would pull to the edge, or sometimes even the center would pull to the edge. And they got to a point where they were running all these different schemes where essentially any lineman could pull in any direction, and sometimes multiple linemen could pull in different directions, um, and that would leave the defensive line going, well, I don't know on any given play if the guard's going to block me, or is this tackle going to block me, or is the center going to block me, is some fullback or tight end going to come in and block me, and then you add in the element of, oh, maybe Jaden Daniels is going to actually, I'm going to be left unblocked and Jaden Daniels is going to read me. And that was powering the run game because guys didn't know what was going to happen. And then the evolution off of that is, okay, well, now they're stopping at the snap. They're wondering who's going to block me. And then you can drop back and play action over the top of them while they're stood there thinking. But the last few weeks, they haven't been quite so diverse. And this week, it felt like because Jaden Daniels was back to his kind of explosive best, and they felt like he was fully healthy, their main run scheme was just going to be read option. They were just going to read option a ton, and I mean the read option was quite successful, but they had like their touchdown drive out of the half.
Mhm.
Um, I think there was 10 plays, and I think 9 of them were read option runs, and some of them were obviously gives, and some of them were Daniels keeping it. Um, but yeah, they went really read option heavy, and that was quite a theme throughout the game. They didn't get into any of those gap scheme stuff where they were pulling lots of guys all over the place. I think they had one GT counter run, and that's been their favorite run all year, and they only had one of those. And they had one sweep where they pull guys to the edge, and that had been successful with them early in the year, and they kind of struggled with it lately. But outside of that, it was pretty much just read options or some very basic schemes inside. So I feel like they need to get back to trying to pull those guys, and it might be a case of um, health. We know a lot of those guys have been dealing with injuries. We know Biadish, I think before the Eagles game, had like 3 things on the injury report, like a shoulder, a hand, and a hip, or something like that. So, um, they are battling those guys, and they could use that bye week to refresh. But um, it does feel like the run game needs um, that diversity to keep defenses off balance. And they've just gotten away from it a little bit, especially last week.
3 years in a row, they'll get the bye week on 14 in week 14 feels a little criminal.
It's tough, and you know, for me, the fun part has been they've been good this year because
Sure, right.
normally by the week 14 bye, I'm thinking, okay, well I can start looking at free agents and draft prospects and not worry about any of this. At least they've been good this year. But yeah, they certainly it certainly felt like they could have used that bye before that tough stretch against the Steelers and the Eagles. And then obviously the Cowboys coming off of that, but you know, a bye week on its own doesn't mean that they're going to play great football coming out of it, but certainly it would help to get some guys fresh, as we talked about those linemen, Brian Robertson, a couple of guys have been battling stuff, but football teams do battle stuff, and I mean the Cowboys had a lot more injuries and a lot more guys missing than Washington did, and they still came out and won the game. So you have to battle through that. I think the thing for Washington is they're just not that deep, and it kind of highlights the fact that it's year one of the rebuild or recalibration, and they need more depth. And you can tell at this point in the season where they had, I think it was 33 new players on the roster this year out of the 53. 33 were new, and probably since then it's increased even further. So yeah, it's one where it is tough. You do feel like they could use with a little bit of an earlier buy, but I think it's one of those where they do lack the depth, and if they had an injury to some key players, like obviously Jaden Daniels, you'd feel like they'd be really struggling without him. If Terry was out for a significant portion of games, then that would be a huge injury. If Cosme missed time, you'd be feeling really bad about that. And on defense, if Frankie Louvu was to go out, I think the whole defense would probably fall apart. So,
That's right.
yeah, it feels like they don't have the depth that some other teams or a lot of the real competitive teams at this point in the season do. So, yeah, that late buy might end up helping them in a way because it gives them a chance to get fresh later in the season and allow those key guys to get a breather and reset, and go again down the stretch. So maybe it works out for them, but it certainly feels tough at this point.
The depth, you make a great point with the depth, and I have it here on my list of things I wanted to talk about. I mean, so you mentioned 60% of the roster they turned over this year. And the crazy thing is, Mark, they'll probably turn over another 60 next year. Like that's, I mean, to me, that's the place where I think people hear rebuild and think it's like, oh, well, they should have gotten T. Higgins at the deadline or this player at the deadline. That's not what rebuilding is. Rebuilding is usually the bottom of that roster that's not very good. And this is to the time, to your point, where it shows. 7-2. I'm curious your thoughts. I was thinking about this the other day. We're talking on my podcast Friday. 7-2. I think everything went. Looking back on it now, I think everything went just about as well as it could have been. Then you play the two Pennsylvania teams, which to me, losing to them isn't a terrible deal. Pittsburgh at home would have been nice, but I mean, I think we now know the Eagles might be one of the better rosters in the league, certainly one of the better teams in the league. So, like again, that loss wasn't terrible, particularly in Philly. The Dallas one is awful. I guess that's a long way, Mark, of getting from 7-2 to 7-5. It feel and people are talking about regression. It feels just more like everything went right for the first 9 weeks, rather than the team has taken some terrible 4 or 5 steps backwards.
Yeah, I don't think they've taken a ton of steps backwards. I think they were. I think they were a much greater sum of the parts for the first 9 games where they were 7-2.
Mm.
Now they're not quite as good at some of the parts as they were, but they're still decent. And for me, I think you take the Cowboys game in isolation. We'll come to that one. Up until that game, if you looked at the games at the start of the year and said the games they would lost to Tampa Bay week one was always going to be a tough one. Baltimore was always going to be tough. They're one of the best teams. Steelers have a very good roster. Yes, they have issues at quarterback, but They have a good roster, strong defense. They're always competitive. Tomlin always gets them up. That's always going to be a tough game. And yes, you could say when you're at 7-2, you want to win that one, and they nearly did for a potentially dodgy fourth down goal. But that one was a tight one, and it was a close one. But you can accept that that's one where it's a good team and they've lost to a good team. And Philly, as much as it sucks to say the Eagles are a very, very good football team, the fact is they are a very, very good football team, and Howie Roseman does a very good job of putting that team together every year. And you kind of just have to accept. And Vic Fangio is one of the better defensive coordinators in the league and has been for a while. So that was always going to be a tough game. So those 4 games, if you'd come into the year thinking, "Oh, that's the only 4 games they would have lost at that point in the season," you'd be over the moon, because this team wasn't expected to win 6 games, let alone be 7-2 at that point. Now, this Cowboys game is one where the situation of the Cowboys being worse than we thought they were this year, and then going into the game, obviously no Dak, no their left guard and right guard, their starting guards were both out. Brandon Cooks was not back yet. Trayvon Diggs was out. DeMarcus Lawrence was out. Like, they had a lot of key players out, and they had not been playing great football for a while. That was one where you felt like this team should, and they were on a short week. They played the Monday night, and Washington played the Thursday night, so they had the extra breather. So then this was the game where it felt like that was the one loss that I feel like it was one where you think, they should have won that one, really. And you can chalk it down to being a divisional game or whatever, but it was still one where you feel like they should have won that one and won that one comfortably, and they didn't. And that was bad. But I don't think we need to overreact, and I think it looks worse coming off the back of the Eagles and Steelers games. But if you put the Eagles and Steelers games in the context of what we just did, where you going into the season, those are 2 very strong teams, and they are still 2 very strong teams. This is the one loss that hurts, and it doesn't have to derail the season. Like, if they come out flying against the Titans on Sunday, then you feel like, okay, that was a one-off, and we can move on from that, and that's fine. They're back in the playoff hunt, and they've got the bye week, and everything's feeling rosy again. If they come out flat against the Titans and they struggle and they lose that game, and then there's the bye, that's going to be a long 2 weeks.
That will be a long 2 weeks.
But yeah, I guess that's a long way of saying I don't think it's a huge regression. I think it's more kind of a reality of where they're at this point.
One of the other big talking points across the league, I guess, but certainly in Commanders fandom land, is this notion that Terry McLaurin just doesn't get enough targets, and that it's Cliff's fault for keeping him on the right side 90% of the time or whatever it is. I mean, the numbers, if you go back to Arizona, show they did the same thing with DeAndre Hopkins, and that's a man that got 140 catches for 1,800, 1,400 yards, whatever it was when he was. So it's not that. I think when you looked at the film, and I'm asking because I know what you saw in the film because I watched the film study, but for those that didn't, teams are just bracketing Terry, right, and making it harder. And I don't know that moving him is going to fix that. I think it has more to do with this roster that we've talked about. Noah Brown's out targeting Terry 27-17 over the last 3 games, and I think that's because teams have just said, find another way to do it. We're not going to let Terry do it.
Yeah, I don't think the thing of him lining up on the left side constantly is as big an issue as people make it out to be, because the way the Cliffs system works, in a typical offense, you would have Terry McLaurin would be your X receiver, so he's going to line up on the side away from the tight end all the time. But the offense will flip the sides of where guys line up based on which hash mark they're on, and which side of the field has more space, and you typically want the more receivers on the side of the field with more space. So typically Terry McLaurin would be lined up in what you would call the boundary, which is the shorter side of the field, and you'd have your other receivers lined up to the field, which is the longer side of the field. And that's the way you would most offenses would go about it. But in Cliff's system, he wants his outside receivers to not have to go run a route and then sprint back and then flip positions, because he wants to be able to line up quickly and snap the ball and go no huddle and up tempo. And he wants to be able to do that at any given point in a drive. So instead of having those outside receivers having to potentially, run a go route, turn around, come all the way back if it's an incompletion, and then flip sides of the field and basically do 100-meter sprint and then run another play. What he does is he keeps them on the same side of the field, and to adapt for that, when the ball is lined up on the left side of the field, on the left hash mark, so Terry McLaurin would be on the left side. He'd be the boundary receiver. He'd be the X, like he normally wouldn't be in most offenses. When the ball goes to the right hash mark, and then Terry McLaurin still stays on the left-hand side, he then becomes the Z receiver in the offense. So it's a different role that he plays when the ball's on the opposite hash mark. So he essentially changes position, but he just stays in the same spot. And they still move him around. Like they never just line him up outside the numbers constantly in the exact same spot. You'll see him line up tight in a bunch set or in a stack set, or just tight to the formation or in the slot and stuff like that. And they did move him around sometimes and put him on the right side occasionally. But for them, he does line up outside left, but he changes roles when he does that. He'll sometimes be the X receiver, sometimes he'll be the Z receiver. And sometimes that means, like, typically in a very, very simplistic form, typically your X receiver is where you want to go to first and foremost on any given play, because your X receiver is your best receiver. But if he's then flipped to the Z receiver, then the other receiver on the other side, which would be Noah Brown, then becomes the X receiver, which would become the primary read on a lot of plays. So it can just be as much of a case of the ball is lined up on the right hash, and therefore Terry is the Z receiver and not getting as many targets. Sometimes it's a case of, like, in the Eagles game, he was bracketed a lot with the quarters coverage the Eagles play, and they were playing to take away the deep shot and take away the outside receivers. That's what they do very well. Like, you watch any offense against the Eagles, you will see the number one receiver does not get a lot of burn. He doesn't get many targets or catches or many yards, and they force you to beat them in other ways. And that's what Washington tried to do when they hit Eckler underneath and stuff a few times. But they just couldn't do, obviously, enough of that. So, yeah, I think it's slightly overblown. It kind of feels like to me when at the start of the season, Terry didn't have any catches the first week or the second week or something, and everyone was saying, "Oh, McLaurin's overrated. They should have traded him for Brandon Ayuk because he's the guy that Jaden Daniels has a rapport with, and they should have made that trade." And then Terry went on a streak of like 5 or 6 games where he's still on track for a career high in yards and catches and touchdowns and stuff. So I think very soon we'll see Terry get the ball plenty. Now, yes, you could say in an individual game, like on Sunday, they didn't do enough to get Terry the ball. That's fine. You can say that. But I think the general idea of he's being restricted because he's playing outside left all the time is a false narrative to me.
And Jaden says, part of the reason that Terry doesn't get the ball is because he's covered. So I move on to the next read. That's where the read tells me to go. How much of that is a factor where Jaden's actually, like, what is the juxtaposition of telling a young quarterback, we've got to get Terry the ball 10 times a game? Like, Malik Neighbors is at a 37% target share, and we've got, our guy at whatever it is, 10 or something ridiculous. But at the same point, I appreciate the quarterback saying, I'm not trying to force the ball in there if the read tells me to move off of him if he's covered.
Yeah, so the Malik Neighbors situation is somewhat different. In New York, they had Daniel Jones, and obviously now they don't have Daniel Jones. But it was basically Malik Neighbors or run the ball. That was kind of the only offense the Giants had.
Right.
In Washington, they're able to do a lot more, and Jaden Daniels is capable of doing a lot more. And I think every coach would be telling Jaden Daniels, "No, we want you to go through your progressions and let the defense dictate where the ball goes to. You design a play for a reason. You have a progression in a read for a reason." And sure, your first progression might be Terry McLaurin more often than not, But if the defense takes it away, or if Terry has a bad route or a bad rep, you can't just force him the ball. And you don't want you don't want Jaden Daniels to develop a habit of just trying to force the ball to his top receiver. You want him to be able to go through the progression and find the right guy. So Jaden's absolutely right in the defense will kind of dictate where the ball goes. Now, you can say Cliff Kingsbury can try to draw more plays up where Terry is that primary read a little bit more often. And I'm sure Cliff is trying to do that. But I think the focus for Washington is that right now their way of winning games is running the ball well, setting up play action. And they haven't been able to run the ball very well the last few games, and that's got them into third and long situations, and then the pass protection's not been able to hold up for them to throw the ball down the field the way they would like to on the play action stuff, and in those third and long situations is always tough. So I think at this point in time, they have a specific way they want to play. That's run the ball, set up play action. And Terry can be really successful off of those play action passes. But they've not been running the ball very successfully. And as I say, they've been getting into third and longs and not sustaining drives. And that's forcing them to go into more drop back passing where the protection doesn't hold up. And if the protection is not holding up, then it doesn't really matter who's out there trying to run routes. It's tough for the quarterback to get them the ball. And the other point I would make about the Dallas game specifically, yes, Terry McLaurin's your number one receiver. He was going up against Deron Bland most of the game, and Deron Bland's a good corner, but you would still back Terry to win that matchup more often than not. But on the other side of the field, the Cowboys didn't have Trayvon Diggs. He was out of the game. So they had a backup corner playing against Noah Brown. Now, you can say Noah Brown isn't a number two receiver on a lot of teams, and that might be a fair criticism, but he is your number two receiver. And in theory, number one corner versus number one receiver, or number two receiver versus a backup corner, which matchup are you going to want to favor more often than not? You're going to want to attack the backup corner. So I think the case of Noah Brown being the one that got so many targets against the Cowboys specifically was because they were trying to attack a backup corner. And if Noah Brown catches a couple of passes instead of having them go through his hands and hit him in the face mask, then we're probably not talking about this topic at all.
Yeah, and Eckler had a few drops that were not of his standard. A lot of drops actually the last couple of weeks. It's been odd. I know this. I know you know this. We've been told by many players and executives that the hardest position to transfer between college and the pros is tight end. And so I know the fan base is itching for more Ben Sinnott. So am I. But what have you thought about the way they've kind of slowly brought him along and tried to not put too much on him at one time?
Yeah, tight end is a difficult position. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that. There's a cat scratching at the door trying to get in now. Sorry, what were we talking about?
Ben Sinnott getting more reps.
Yeah. So with Ben
Well, not
Sinnott,
more
it's
reps.
kind of,
I guess more pass catching reps because he actually gets a fair amount of playing time. Yeah.
Yeah. So the situation with Sinnott for me is that they really like Zach Ertz, rightly or wrongly. They love Zach Ertz for what he can do in the offense, for his familiarity in the offense, for the kind of reliable finding spaces for Jaden Daniels in key spots, and being able to use the kind of savvy veteran moves to separate when he needs to. And so they place a high value on Zach Ertz as the pass catcher. John Bates is still the best blocking tight end. Now, Ben Sinnott in a year or two might be better than Bates, but right now, John Bates is still their best blocking tight end. So you're in a situation where if you're in 11 personnel trying to pass, it's Zach Ertz is going to be the guy that's out there. If you're in 12 personnel, you're going to want John Bates in there because he's your top run blocker. So unless you're wanting both Bates and Sinnott on the field at the same time to run block, which they do a fair bit of that. But then you're looking at Bates and Sinnott are both there to block and stay in to chip on play action, and you're only really putting Noah Brown and Terry McLaurin out in routes. So the opportunities are just really limited, and he's kind of stuck in this spot where Zach Ertz has stayed healthy all year, John Bates has stayed healthy all year, so his opportunities are really, really limited, and they don't do a ton of 13 personnel. So it's just a case of he's not had a lot of opportunities. Now, it might be behind the scenes that he hasn't quite developed as a route runner as they might like, or he's still got some stuff to learn in that regard. He was quite raw coming out of college in terms of route running, but he is someone that I think is really physical after the catch and could put up a lot more after the catch than Zach Ertz does. And I kind of feel like you could find ways to get in the ball quite easily on underneath routes and stuff, and let him go do that. But again, to get him on the field to do that, you're taking Zach Ertz off the field, or you're taking a slot receiver off the field, or one of they quite like to get into their 21 personnel package where they've got two running backs. It's Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler and Jeremy McNichols. And again, at that point, it's just Zach Ertz on the field, not Ben Sinnott. So I think at this point, it seems like Sinnott's probably not going to get much of a chance unless Ertz gets injured to catch many passes. Unless, they lose to the Titans and go on a losing streak. And then maybe towards the end of the year when the playoffs are out of the picture, then you start bringing in guys like Sinnott and McCaffrey and then the younger guys to give them more reps at the end of the year for experience for next year. But I think he's just kind of caught in this unfortunate spot where he's kind of the backup to both spots, and both Bates and Ertz have stayed healthy the entire year and played pretty well. You could probably say you want a little bit more out of both, but they're both still ahead of Sinnott at this point.
Either, neither, just one. What do you feel about the tackles in there, and who you'd bring back next year as far as the offensive tackles?
Yeah, well, I'd certainly bring back Coleman.
But is he a starter? Like, are you happy to roll him out at left tackle next year?
I don't know about left tackle necessarily.
Okay.
I think he's had some up and downs. He had a few real nice games, and he's also had a few games where you go, yeah, maybe he's not a left tackle. He's had a lot of help, and the stuff they've done to help the offensive line in general this year has been really impressive. With the chip help they constantly have done, has really helped their tackles. But when you want a left tackle, you in an ideal world you want a Trent Williams that you can put on an island and say, I'm just going to not have to worry about your best pass rusher, leave him one-on-one, and then I can provide help to the rest of the offensive line. Now, obviously, there's not 32 Trent Williams out there, so it's going to be tough to find that guy. And it might be a case of you have to stick with a guy that you need to help, and if that's the case, that's fine. You can still, as we've seen this year, run a very productive offense doing that. But I kind of feel like I'm not sure Coleman will ever become that level of left tackle. At which point, if you get a chance this offseason to find that guy, and that is much easier said than done, then perhaps you look at, you move on from Andrew Wiley because he's got quite a high cap hit next year. And I don't know if they will want to. Well, I'll get to Andrew Wiley in a minute, but that cap hit might mean that they don't want to keep him at his current contract. So maybe you kick Brendan Coleman to the right side and you bring in a new left tackle on the left side, and a guy like Ronnie Stanley with the Ravens. I think he's due to be a free agent, and I think their cap is in a little bit of a tight spot, so they might not be able to bring him back. And maybe that's someone that you could say, okay, we'll be aggressive in free agency, go out and get him, and we know we can lock down our left tackle spot and then move Coleman to the right side. And so that might be a scenario that would be favorable to them. I do think Andrew Wiley has played well this year. I think Andrew Wiley is he's what I've been saying he has been all along. If you help him a little bit, he's a decent tackle. And they've provided the chip help for him, and he's been pretty solid all year. And in the run game, he's been really, really good. Him and Sam Cosmi have been really beating guys up on that offensive line. Whenever they run any kind of double team on that side, whatever guy is going up against them is getting run into the ground pretty consistently. It's quite fun to watch. So those two have a really good rapport. So you don't necessarily want to break that up. But Andrew Wiley's on a contract. I think he's due $8 million on the cap next year. But you could cut him for like 100,000 or something like that, and get away pretty much free from out of that contract. So from a financial point of view, you probably move on from Andrew Wiley. Maybe you try to bring him back on a different contract, or you restructure his deal, or do something with that deal, but not on his current price tag. At which point you then need a right tackle. And if you're looking at trying to bring in a new tackle, I kind of feel like the best situation might be go all out for a top left tackle and move Coleman to the right side. Now, obviously, that will come with, is Coleman comfortable playing on the right side? He's played left his whole career. So there is the whole, he has to then learn how to do everything backwards kind of thing. But, you'd have to see how he feels with that. But at the same time, you have to feel comfortable with him at left tackle if he's not going to play right side. So, and I'm not sure that you ever feel, I don't know if I feel like he's ever going to be that lockdown left tackle, like a Trent Williams level. And that's a very high level to expect out of anyone. But I don't think he's ever going to reach that level. And there are other guys maybe potentially better positioned to get closer to that level than him.
They did move him around a bunch, I think, out of necessity when he was in college. But to your point, I asked Pugh, Justin Pugh, who was a tackle guard for the Giants, about switching sides, and I had heard that it was like writing with a different hand. And he said, "Well, some guys do it different ways, but I always try to explain it this way: go to the bathroom today and try to wipe with the left if you're used to wiping with the right, and it's not quite as easy as it may appear to be from the beginning." Let's talk a little bit about defense before we get out of here. It's been easy the last couple of weeks to knock on Cliff because of the history of second halves with Cliff. I get that. I'm not sure I'm buying into it this time, but I get that. It feels like Joe Witt Jr. then maybe is getting a pass because it felt like the defense felt like if you'd asked people at the beginning of this season, we were going to have a defensive minded team that would rely on the run to keep us in games and squeak out wins. That was not how this season started by any means. Is Joe's defense getting a pass? Because I mean, frankly, it should be better.
I think for me, the thing with Witt's defense is that they haven't had the personnel to do what they want to do.
Couldn't you
And
say that about the offense?
yes, the offense, having Jaden Daniels gives you a lot of flexibility on offense to do different things.
Yes.
And so they've been able to have that flexibility in the run game to set up other things. I think it's a philosophical question, because I think you can either come into a new situation and go, what are the guys we have? What's the best way to get the most out of the guys we have right now? Or you can come into a new situation and go, we're going to be here. This is a new regime. We're going to be here 3 years. The best for the guys right now isn't necessarily going to be what we want to be in 3 years' time. So do we want to set our stall out of, we want to play this type of way with this type of coverage with this type of player, and try to fit the guys that can do that into our system now so that they can be long-term pieces, and figure out the guys that aren't going to be long-term pieces so that we can move on from them in years 2 and 3 and build up the team that we want to be? Or do we want to try to accommodate the guys that we have now and be a more of a middling defense that can have some success in year 1, but it's never going to progress higher because you're kind of stuck in this kind of middle ground? And so for me, it feels like what the approach they've taken is they want to be this aggressive man coverage, blitzing a ton defense. That what we saw in Dallas, where they played a ton of man coverage on the outside. They had corners playing off with vision, attacking on routes and jumping routes for interceptions. And they were able to play that aggressive on routes because they were blitzing 5-6 guys constantly. They'd move versatile guys like Michael Parsons around to create matchups and rush so effectively that quarterbacks would have no option but to throw quickly. And when you throw quickly with corners that are playing often with vision, they can jump those routes and create turnovers. And that is the style that I think Quinn and Witt want to play now. But to do that, you need to have a flexible rush piece, and they have a few. Obviously, they brought Fowler and Armstrong over from Dallas. Luvu is their big, playing the kind of Parsons role, not necessarily to Parsons level, but a good level. And I still think there may be a piece or two short there, but they're getting there, and you can kind of make up for that with blitz packages that you put together. But you also need the guys on the outside to be able to play man coverage. And at the start of the year, when it was St. Just and Forbes and Sam were still in the slot, almost none of them could cover man to man consistently.
Right.
Now Sam still has improved a lot since they moved him outside. And he's become one of their more reliable corners. Now he still has a ways to go. He still makes plenty of mistakes, but you can see the improvement and you can see the upside and you can see he fits what they want in a corner. So that works. And you're also seeing on the other side of the field, St. Just is still making the same repetitive mistakes over and over again.
Real quick, not to cut you off, but I wanted to ask you this anyway. I don't like going back and harping on the old staff because they're gone and it doesn't do much good to do that. But I was high on St. Just coming out of college. He feels like a Dan Quinn guy. Is he one of these that, listen, sometimes you just get it wrong? Or was he devastated by the lack of quality coaching he got in his first 3 years under the Ron Rivera regime and the high school cornerback coach?
Yeah, it's tough to say.
Sure.
Only he would really know that. My take on that is I thought St. Just was very raw coming out of college. He was this really toolsy player. He was obviously has great size, really long arms, great measurables, and he had an amazingly quick 3-cone and like agility testing numbers, which sometimes show up on the field. Sometimes they don't quite match up with what you see on the field. But it suggested you had this big, long corner that could move, that was really quick, not necessarily fast, long speed, but quick over a short distance. And that's 100% what they would like in this defense on paper. But he was really raw, and he was really handsy at the top of routes, and the first 2 years he was in the league, I think he had Chris Harris, who's a quite a highly viewed defensive backs coach, as his DB coach.
Yeah, okay.
And we saw some positive development from him, but we saw some consistent up and downs from him. And then obviously they had the last year or two, I can't remember whether it was 2 years or if it was just the last year without Harris in the Rivera regime. And they had that high school DB coach come in under Jack Del Rio. And that obviously wouldn't have helped him or any of the corners. And the secondary definitely all suffered at that point. So you don't want to hold that against him. But he's now, 14 games or 13, or where are we, 12 games into this regime. And on my Substack this week, I talked a little bit about St. Just. You see him make the same mistakes constantly over the course of the season. He gives up the same type of routes every time. Like the Giants burnt him 4 times over the course, or more than 4 times. But the examples I showed, there was 4 curl routes where a receiver runs to about 10 or 12 yards of depth and then break off back to the quarterback. And every single time they ran that route at him, he would end up taking 2 or 3 extra steps at the top of the route, give that separation up and give up the catch before he could then close on the guy and make the tackle. And that was consistent throughout the year. I saw it against the Ravens. I saw it against the Browns. I saw the Steelers got him on it with George Pickens once or twice. Like every team has pretty much got him on those type of routes throughout the year. And you can kind of accept it to an extent when you say, okay, we want you to protect against anything deep. So you can take those extra few steps. We don't mind you giving up the curl underneath, because at the end of the day, a 10 or a 12-yard curl isn't going to be the make or break of a game for us. We don't want you to give up a 50-yard touchdown. So as long as you're not giving up a double move on that, then that's fine. But then you go back to the Steelers game, one of those last plays of the game where was it Mike Williams, the guy they just traded for from the
Yes.
Jets, that's known as a double move deep threat guy, comes on the field for one of the few reps that he played in the game, and it's 3rd and 7 just outside the red zone. In that situation, you have to know he's going deep, and you have to be aware that like this whole season you've been giving up the curls and the comebacks and the underneath stuff to protect the deep shot. You cannot in that situation give up the deep shot. And what does he do? He gives up the deep shot. He bites on a double move that it wasn't even the double move that he bit on. He just thought it was the wrong route, and gave up the deep shot. And then he comes out afterwards, and fair play to him for coming out and saying like, "Hey, I held my hands up. I was responsible. I played the wrong route. I should have been playing for the fade. I can't let that happen." That takes a lot of courage to go out and say that. But he's done that every year of his career. He's always done. He's been great at fronting up, but at some point you don't front up anymore. You just got to make the correct play. And so for me, I feel like he's in year 4. He's got to know better than that. And if he's not picking up on that now, is he ever going to? And so, yeah, I kind of feel like the writing's on the wall for him now. I feel like the way Sanders still has played, once Lattimore is healthy and able to go, I think it's going to be Lattimore and Sanders still on the outside for the rest of this year. And then maybe in the off season, they find another corner and move Sanders still back inside. So yeah, I kind of feel like the St. Juice time here is limited.
The fact that he played the least amount of snaps this last week since his rookie season probably says all we need to know about that. Because I originally just assumed that it would be the 2 tall corners outside and they'd move Mikey back inside. But I'm with you. It just doesn't feel like that makes a whole lot of sense to do right now. Let's take just a couple minutes on the game coming up. Kind of teams that are similar in a way. I feel like. I mean, I guess it depends on how you like Will Levis. I guess I like Will Levis fine. I watched him a bunch of Kentucky's. He's another one of these guys that's toolsy, right? Good luck getting all the tools to work. He's
Yeah.
been better the last couple of days. He loves to turn the ball over. That's what I'd say about the offensive side of the ball. And they got a running back that's pretty good. And the Commanders haven't stopped a runner in a while. On the other side of the ball, it feels like we've had a month of game wreckers on defense, and Justin Simmons on the defensive line is another one of those guys.
Yeah, he certainly is, and they have a stout run defense overall, even without him. But with him in there, obviously, can really cause you issues. Yeah, I think it will be a tougher one than they would have anticipated. Certainly, a month ago.
Yes.
A month ago, it would have been thinking they maybe beat one of the Steelers and Eagles. They should walk through the Cowboys and Titans game and get to the bye feeling really comfortable. But yeah, now I'm no longer thinking it's a comfortable win, but I do still think it's a game that uh they probably should be winning. They are certainly capable of winning. It's not one of the games where they're feeling completely outmatched, like the Baltimore game or the Tampa game at the start of the year. It feels like it's one that they should certainly be competitive in. And if Jaden is back to his best, and he certainly showed signs of that late in that Cowboys game, then you feel a lot better about their chances. I think at this point,
It might not be a must win, Mark, but it
no,
feels pretty close to a must win.
I think it feels close to a must win because it's the bye week after it, and it's going to be a nightmare couple of weeks to be talking about this team if they lose. So for that mistake, it is a must win because I don't want to deal with that. But I do. It's not a must win in terms of playoffs, but it does feel like it's a game where the support for the team and the team is kind of in a bit of a balance, and like as I say, as we kind of talked about, like the Steelers and the Eagles games are ones where obviously you're never accepting a loss, but it's 2 losses where those are 2 very good football teams, and Washington's just not there yet to be able to compete with those levels of football teams on a consistent basis, and hold on and win those games, even though they were close to winning. Probably, certainly the Steelers game, they were probably could have won that Eagles game too, I think, but they didn't. Obviously, the Cowboys game is the one that you think, okay, there is a chance in a Dan Snyder era after that Cowboys game. You think, okay, the season's falling apart and
Right.
they're going to get smashed in this one. I think this is one where Dan Quinn and Adam Peters have a chance to be like, okay, guys, we flush that game, we flush the Cowboys game, we get back on track, we win this game, and everyone's kind of can take a deep breath and a deep sigh and let out, okay, we're okay, we've won another game, we've snapped the losing streak, we're going into the bye, we're going to get healthy, we're going to come out the bye, and we probably only need one or two wins to get ourselves a wild card spot. And so that I think you're just feeling a lot better about where the regime's at. If they go and lose this game, then it's not crisis mode, but it will feel like crisis mode. Whereas if they come out of this one with a win, it speaks to their ability to bounce back from that adversity of a really bad loss against Dallas, and it shows that Quinn and Peters have built up a culture that is ahead of schedule.
I have not looked at your score prediction yet for the score group. What is it? What is the score for Sunday?
I don't think I've made one yet. I'm still thinking about it. I usually wait for the last injury report. Uh, I think I'm going to give it to Washington. I'm leaning towards Washington, especially if Lattimore plays. That should give him a big boost on defense. And if Brian Robinson comes through, which it sounds like he might, if Andrew Wiley comes out of the concussion protocol, which it sounds like he might, if things go their way, I think they should be able to turn this one around. I think Quinn has built up enough credit in the bank for me to believe them to say that they will bounce back for this one. I don't think it will be an easy one. I don't think they'll go and put 40 on them. I think it's one of those where it'll be like a 20-17 kind of game. I don't know if that is my score prediction officially, but it's going to be something like that. A very close game that they edge out around about 20 points.
And it sounds like it's going to be like 39 degrees at kickoff, which I know for you over in Sweden might not be a big deal, but it's probably the coldest game Jaden Daniels will have ever played in.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the cold is a thing. I don't know how much of a thing it really is. Like, obviously, there's certain conditions. Like, if it's windy, then it's tougher to throw the ball. If it's cold, you just, put a jacket on the sideline. You'll be fine.
I'm sure he'll be saying that as he gets nailed by 275-pound DNs.
They'll
Mark,
run
this
away
was
from
great.
it. It's fine.
We always appreciate you. Hopefully, they get the win because I know Tuesdays are always better after
Oh, yeah.
wins. Listen, we feel real lucky to have you and Ackridge doing the shows on Tuesday. So we appreciate you for that. For those watching that aren't already subscribed to Mark Bullock's Substack, the link is in the YouTube, so make sure you hit that. And Mark, thank you. Enjoy your weekend, buddy.
Of course, you too.